Hi, this is Paul. I'm just going to do a little video. We'll see how little it is. Actually, I was going to do a little video just on the teaser that James Fox Higgins published, I think yesterday or the day before, of his beginning of his conversation with Jonathan Peugeot. Actually, I had a fruitless run to Costco because I forgot my watch, and got a chance to listen to the whole video, which was really rather good. And James Fox Higgins is a young man who was in a sense brought to Christ by Jordan Peterson, and he's working this stuff out. And Jonathan Peugeot obviously is very well informed, and especially in the Orthodox tradition, Calvinism got bandied about a little bit. Calvinism is a very broad thing, and yeah, I'll just leave it there. Calvinism is a very broad thing, and there are many different kinds of Calvinists, and so often the conversation on Calvinism gets reduced to a conversation about the doctrine of election. And it's important to remember that the doctrine of election is something shared by the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church and the Calvinists and the Orthodox, as Jonathan said, and that's true. I have my knowledge of Orthodox, capital O, Orthodox Christianity is really quite deficient, but I do know enough to know that the Orthodox navigate that conversation differently. And the focus of this video is not Calvinism or not Calvinism, or the doctrine of election or no. But I thought this was a good conversation between the two of them. It gets Jonathan goes into a lot of the kinds of things Jonathan goes into, and I thought it was well worth listening. The piece that I originally wanted to talk about this though was the question that keeps coming up. Is Peterson a Christian now? Should he convert? Should he formally start going to church? And Jonathan has some good stories in this video, and I agree with Jonathan's point in that right now, if Jordan Peterson, I'm not suggesting that he shouldn't formally be baptized or convert or start going to church someplace. I would, as a Christian minister, they'd take away my ordination if I would suggest that he shouldn't convert. But the fact that he doesn't associate or identify with any specific congregation or any specific denomination, or even his answers with respect to Christianity itself are ambiguous. And in a bunch of my older videos, I've categorized Peterson as an agnostic, as I think that's formally the position he's taking. Act as if this is the Peterson's church, as if, and I'm not gonna, yeah, I'm just gonna, that's where Peterson's at. I'm gonna leave that where it is. I don't have any inside information or anything like that. So, but the question of how his association or identification with formally with Christianity or with a specific tradition would impact it's terrible editing, on he's having on the conversation would be important. And I think, one of the earlier videos I did on actually this was the first video of mine that Peterson tweeted on kind of comparing Jordan Peterson with The Office, and his staying in the middle kind of keeps the tension alive and keeps the romantic tension alive. And it may be that someday in the future he, for reasons of his own, decides to associate with a church or decides to more formally call himself a Christian, and with all the delimitations that would require for him. But at this point he's keeping the conversation alive, and he's bread pilling people, and as a Christian minister, I'm fine with that. But part of what's been going on, I know a lot of people were really excited about Peterson talking to William Craig Evans, and a number of people said I should do a treatment on that conversation, and maybe I will. But in some ways, I see his conversation with Matt Dillahunty a lot like his conversation with William Craig Evans, because in many ways both Dillahunty and Craig Evans are modernists, and and Peterson comes at them as a phenomenological pragmatist, and that deeply impacts the basically how you approach life. And I talked about this quite a bit in my last video where I talked about Scott Adams. It's almost as if the modernists are approaching truth like a movie, and truth is something truth is something that we fundamentally see. It's something that's, you know, a little bit distant from myself. It's something that's separate from myself. Whereas for Peterson, truth is much more active, and reality is not a movie that we're watching, but reality is a form for action. And you know, there's a lot in the Bible about that. Jesus, for example, tells a parable of two sons, and one son, the father tells the sons, go do this, and one son says he would and he doesn't, and the other son says he wouldn't and he does, and Jesus says, okay, which one was obedient? And so Christianity has built within itself this bias for action, and you can find this regularly throughout the parables of Jesus. Now, at the same time, Christianity also has a bias for belief, but part of what happens in our conversations with respect to this is, you know, pistis, for example, the Greek in the New Testament for this word that usually gets translated believe, is also have faith. And I remember early in the ministry, I once did some switching, and, you know, I had to lead a Bible study or something, and I switched all of believe for have faith in, and switched the word faith for belief in a copy of the Bible that I handed out. And people started getting annoyed because it sounded too active. It sounded too it basically sounded too active. And with some of the traditions that have come up, especially in Protestantism, there then was raised a question of faith versus works. And this is a conversation that regularly comes up within Protestantism, not so much in the Roman Catholic tradition. Again, I really have to upgrade my knowledge of the Orthodox tradition. The Orthodox Church is quite a latecomer to the American scene, and that's really important to remember. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the Orthodox Church in the next 100 years, now that it's here in America and it's increasingly having an impact. So I'll leave that where it is. But part of the, you know, people are always saying, well, I want Jordan Peterson to talk to this person, I want Jordan Peterson to talk to that person. And as I said before, neither Peterson nor Dillahunty have probably as much time, nor should they necessarily make it a priority to study each other's work, because they're both moving up these hierarchies. And as I mentioned before, sorry for the pause, I had to sneeze. As I mentioned before, hierarchies filter as they gain access. Even as someone is going up a hierarchy, they still only have 24 hours in a day. And even if they're adding staff to make themselves more efficient, or adding organizations or institutions to basically amplify what they're able to do, we still only have 24 hours in a day, and that's a limitation we have. And as I talked about in my last video, I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about consciousness as I'm thinking more about phenomenology. And so when Peterson talks to Dillahunty, or when Peterson talks to William Craig Evans, or even when Peterson deals with a bunch of these other conversations, you know, it's remarkably difficult to have a productive conversation. And that's something that might not be self-evident to a lot of people, but as someone whose job it is to have conversations with people, conversations are very hard because people are very complicated, and the difficulty goes up when we, you know, videotape them and have them in front of a lot of people. Now Peterson is a clinical psychologist, so he's having conversations with people all the time. I'm a Christian Reformed minister, so I'm having conversations with people all the time. If you look at the conversation, for example, that I had with John Van Sloten, you know, both of us are, you know, very experienced conversationalists. We both knew each other. We have a high degree of commonality in terms of our knowledge, our background knowledge. Conversations are very, very difficult. So a lot of the conflict that I see happening, let's say, between someone like Delahunty, whose gig is to, disprove Christianity, and Jordan Peterson, who, how to categorize his gig right now. I mean, he's promoting his view of the world, and his view of the world is, I think, leading to people converting for some very real reasons. And I actually rewatched a video that Jonathan Peugeot has done on a comment that he got from an atheist. And I think there's a lot of gold in that video in terms of understanding exactly why Jordan Peterson is having the effect he's having. And this project that I've been working on, my Jordan Peterson project, for the last 8 months, no, we're getting on to a year now of listening to his stuff. I think I'm finally beginning to understand bit by bit kind of the underpinnings of why he's having the effect he's having on people, and why, after people listen to him, they are far more open to Christianity. And I think it has everything to do with the Enlightenment and with modernism. Now what's interesting in the conversation with, forgot his name, James Fox Higgins and Jonathan Peugeot, is that when we get into talking about what happened in the Protestant church and that history, there is a lot going on there in terms of culture and philosophy. And I've dealt with some of that in some of my earlier videos. I'm probably going to have to revisit it. Somebody made a comment that, what you seem obsessed with modernity. And okay, I probably am, because I'm trying to figure it out, because it appeared to me, at least until the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. And again, this is why I've given it so much attention. And this is why I think this is, at least in my experience, something of major importance. Until the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, it seemed that Christianity into modernity was a one-way street. And modernists had been for centuries having a corrosive effect on Christianity. And this gets into lots and lots of areas. And so what I saw in Peterson, which I had not seen, was the possibility of a mass change in this. Now this is rather interesting, because these categorizes of modernity and postmodernity and traditional, and I forget the video I watched of a guy, the emergent, this kind of emergent thinking, what's after post, what's postmodernity, so on and so forth. These categories are labels that we're using to try to identify some things, but they're pretty, it's very, very difficult. For example, someone had made the comment that that Scott Adams is not postmodern, because postmodernity says that we can't know facts, and I think that's true. But you could talk about postmodernity. Every time you use one of these labels, in some senses you have to define them, and by the time you're done defining them, you've forgotten what you want to talk about, because we're always living in the moment and we're conscious creatures. So in some respects, Peterson is very modern, and especially when Peterson picks up this label of being a classical liberal, because classical liberalism is, in a sense, probably the height of modernity. And so in some senses, Peterson is very modern. In some other senses, he's got some postmodernity in him, and in some other ways, with his phenomenology, if, as I'm looking at this, trying to educate myself more in terms of phenomenology, I mean, phenomenology is really a response to the failures of modernity to actually arrive at certainty. And so what tends to happen, what I think is happening, is that what Peterson is doing is using the tools of modernity that had proven to be so corrosive to Christianity. Those tools themselves are now, how do you even say this? What's happening? Those tools themselves are now undermining that case against Christianity. And so it isn't a mystery when you look at the main lights that Peterson is using, why this would be the case. I mean, Peterson is focusing on Nietzsche. He's focusing on Dostoevsky, on Kierkegaard, on Solzhenitsyn, and Darwin, and so this is what's happening. And so, again, I've seen Peterson. Why am I so interested in Peterson? Why am I studying him so hard? Why do I continue to be fascinated in him? Because I think for the first time, what we're seeing from Peterson is that there's a door out of modernity, and it's not necessarily through postmodernity, but it's not disconnected from it. There's a door out of modernity that seems to be giving new life to what looks like traditional Christian belief. And I hadn't really seen that before. I've seen reversions from modernity. I've seen an attempt at a postmodern Christianity. And as I've said earlier, I think the element of the culture war that is at work especially within Protestantism, and it's significant that the social justice movement within the Christian church is strongest within Protestantism, within, at this point, mainline Protestantism. That is perfectly reasonable if you can, and I'm not able to articulate all this yet, if you can actually follow the thread through the Reformation into modernity and then into postmodernity. There are deep connections between postmodernity and this identitarian phase. In a sense, this rigid identitarianism is kind of the low-hanging fruit if you've embraced postmodernity and lost all points of orientation. And so then we're starting to default to skin color or to gender or to orientation and to nationalism and to all these elements all these elements that are basic and obvious and easy to create groups around. And so I think while we're seeing both in the main line and this group that's called progressive evangelicals, the attempt to construct a postmodern Christianity, my view of that has been skeptical. And it's been skeptical because I see both the progressive evangelicals and the main line devolving into all of the kinds of eating themselves in identitarian ways that we're seeing the non-Christian postmoderns doing. In other words, I think there's a self-destructive nature to that is self-destructive for community. And kind of, again, this is where labels are different, because when I talk about the liberal church, I'm not meaning the same as classical liberalism. That there are deep connections between them, but when we talk about the liberal church, we're talking about the mainline church, and we're talking about the thread of skepticism and the attempts at addressing the break apart of Christianity that happened in the Reformation. And I don't mean that ecclesiastically. I mean that in terms of the epistemology. As I've gone in before, after, as Europe was destroying itself over the Reformation, there became a crisis of authority with respect to texts. And so the movement was to try to find certainty and therefore community, because I think generally speaking, the search for certainty is also a search for community. And we see that deeply in science and technology. But this search that is happening is so basically what happened was the Darwin changes in assumptions about history, Rachel Brown made some really good comments. I watched the conversation between Jonathan Pizot and Rachel Brown. There were some really good elements in that conversation too, where so both of them are medievalists, and in the medieval period, there was this multivocal reading of the text. You could have the symbolic element of the text, more the literal element of the text. You had all of these symbolic elements of the text. And what happens in the Reformation is that, basically the Reformation takes a hammer to all of this. Now, I'm a Christian Reformed pastor, so I got to be careful about the Reformation. From a very young age, when you hear Reformation, you learn to salute. But I'm not going to say that I'm not going to say that the Reformation was unwarranted. What Luther tried to do was reform the church. And so the church pushed back on Luther, and Luther was in some ways had a personality like Jordan Peterson. If you pushed Martin Luther, he's going to push back, and Martin Luther could push back hard. And there was a lot of pent up stuff in the political world, in the economic world, in the philosophical world, in the religious world that was waiting to be catalyzed, and everything was right where Luther was, and whoosh, it hit. And that's telling, because if you look at the places where the Protestant Reformation dug in and the places where it didn't get traction or it was destroyed. And so then you look at France, and of course John Calvin was a French refugee who fled to Switzerland, who set up shop in Geneva and started writing things. And if you look at where a lot of the Reformed churches grew, you can look at the Switzerland, and Jung's father was a Swiss Reformed pastor, and you look at the Netherlands, where my tradition comes from. Again, a place of tolerance. Well, and there's a long, complicated history in there. But so this multivocal reading of the text that happened in the Middle Ages, all through the Middle Ages, and very, very early on, it started in the Church Fathers. You can find it in Origen, and on from there. Well, the reformers saw that as splitting apart the world in some ways, and they were looking for certainty, and they were looking to base their authority on the text, not on the institution of the church, which was seen as corrupt. And let's give Luther his due. There was a lot of corruption in the Roman church, and so on and on and on and on. That's a tremendously important history. It's a tremendously involved history, but that very much gets into why Peterson is changing the conversation. And it's also the reason why Peterson, when he sits down with Matt Dillahunty and when they haven't studied each other, the conversation just isn't terribly productive. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see the conversation with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, that we know Jordan Peterson is studying. He's read all of Sam Harris's books. They should, hopefully have a more productive conversation, but I wouldn't be surprised if they don't. And again, my tradition of Calvinism, again, Calvinism is very broad. Presuppositions are a really big deal, because these presuppositions that we have are deep within our culture, and they're deep within our makeup, and the reasons we talk about foundational things is that the building above can only be supported depending on the nature of the foundation. I had to say goodbye to my son, and got interrupted. And so again, back to Sometimes people ask me, well, how do you plan your videos? And well, sometimes I plan them, and sometimes they just happen. And again, I'm thinking all this stuff out loud and trying to learn as I go. And again, it's been amazing, reading your comments. I've learned so much from you people, and I just feel, if all of you were one Patreon, I should have to pay you. So then, when you get, oh, that's right, I was talking about Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. This foundational difference between modernity and phenomenology makes it hard for the two groups to talk and have a productive conversation. And so, one of the real things is seeing versus acting. And so just in, the last few days or even weeks, as I'm trying to get my mind around this question, what is existence? What is reality? What is the world? And I mean, obviously, Peterson has affected me deeply. Phenomenology is starting to impact me. But this combination of matter and moments, and how, I did a video yesterday. Now I'm wearing a different shirt. The matter of my body hasn't changed that much from yesterday to today. But again, if you look in my sermon, I talk about this a little bit. I'm a very different creature than I was 20 years ago. How have I changed from yesterday to today? Well, I've had experiences all day, and I've had conversations with people, and so that has, created. We don't really know how that impacts the brain, but we do know that, with brain plasticity, and the brain actually changes as we think, and so there's a deep mind-body connection. And so, I'm going through in these moments, and I've always known this as a pastor because, for example, there are things that happen in life where worlds change. I don't know if I have this book right here. I'm at home right now. The Body Keeps the Score, which is a book I read a couple years ago on trauma. And that if you work with someone who has been, let's say, abused as a child, or that trauma gets stuck, and the trauma gets stuck in our bodies. I mean, not just in our brains, but in our bodies. And so, well, what kind of being are we, and what kind of reality are we? And even in some ways, I think about, in what ways am I differentiated from the world around me? I mean, I can touch this computer, I can touch this mouse, I can touch this table. There's a very clear distinction between the world around me and me. But when it comes to, like, my sisters that I grew up with, there's some deep ties between us. And you look at that with twins, identical twins, or, there's deep ties between us, and we don't understand any of this stuff. And that's why every time Peterson says, we don't really understand consciousness, he's right. And because we don't understand consciousness, we don't understand reality. And again, this is part of the reason why I've been enjoying watching Scott Adams, because, Scott Adams is trying to, take seriously how much we don't know, and he's trying to apply it. But that in and of itself is exactly the dilemma, that you might sit there and watch this movie and say, we have no idea what's going on with this movie. What I'm seeing in this movie is probably only a little bit of what's actually real. And again, if you go to Jordan Peterson's April question and answer, he gets into that. He's saying, how much of reality do we know? Well, I know a tiny bit of the reality of sitting here in my living room right now. That's what I know. And I hear my son, who is shaving over there, and my dog is snorting over here, because you never heard a little dog snore louder than this dog. But on and on and on and on. And with knowledge, the amount of knowledge I have is tiny, tiny, tiny. So what do we know? And again, for me, people always ask, well, why your Calvinism? Well, this is a part of my Calvinism, because Calvinism as an aspect of Calvinism is, my particular take on Calvinism is that it's one of the more skeptical aspects about our capacity to know and our capacity to save ourselves. And that's part of why I stay with my version of Calvinism, because if my ability to rescue myself or be productive about myself is based on and again, it's really hard to even define what me is. I've been listening, I forget the guy. Someone mentioned a guy who's doing, who has this nice little course on, nice little course on, philosophy of the mind. So I'm going through that right now. And again, the guy puts it really well and has given me new thoughts and ideas, but you realize how much you don't know. And even, here's a crazy thing. Say you're listening to me, and let's say you say, I'm learning a lot from Paul Vanderklay. Well, how much really? Because in the moment you might see something and like, wow, I see it. And then the next moment it's gone. So you have to go back and you have to see it again, and then it's gone. And so, if I really want to learn something, like for example C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, I need to read it over and over and over and over again. And each time I read the book, I see more, and then I read it and I see more, and then the stuff that I read before stays with me longer. And this is where reading and talking and acting come into play, because the truth is, you don't really know something until you can, and this is what you learn in school, until you can explain it in your own words, until you can articulate it, and can articulate it regularly and repeat it. And you don't really know something until you act on it, and you don't really believe anything until you act on it. Again, all this stuff is Jordan Peterson 101. So if you watch Maps of Meaning, if you watch these other things, this is the stuff he relates. And when I first started learning this stuff, it rang true, but I had never seen it that way. And then as I continue, in my so far 1 year learning from Jordan Peterson's course, well, this is what I'm learning, and I'm appreciating it. But I'm going to have to admit that even though I feel like I'm learning all of this stuff, this is just tiny, tiny things. Now, what does that mean? That means that, let's say 4 or 5 years from now, I've kind of exhausted everything that I think I can learn from Jordan Peterson, and then, maybe I'm on to the next thing. And then at some point, this all gets interrupted by death. And you might say, boy, isn't that a waste? And I would say, yeah, that's a real waste. And then I would say, what if it isn't interrupted by death? And you would say, well, wait a minute. You've just finished talking about the fact that everything that you've learned has been, somehow encoded in your brain, and, that brain is decaying, and it might fall victim to senility or Alzheimer's, or you might have a terrible car accident and my head gets squashed like a grape. And then you would say, all of that is Paul Vanderklay goes away. And I would say, as a Christian, I say no. You'd say, why not? And I'd use the sharecropper's wife's answer, which is, God knows. Well, God knows what? Well, God knows me. Well, what do you mean God knows you? I mean, God knows me. Well, okay, which me does God know? Does God know the 6-year-old me, or the 12-year-old me, or the 20-year-old me, or the 54-year-old me? I'd say God knows all of them, and God knows the entire process all the way through. And then you might say, well, are you saying that God is pantheon, that God is the sum of all things? And I would say, God knows all things, but God is more than just all things. And that God, in fact, has a will, and via Christianity, 3 persons. And you might say, well, okay, so God has persons. Well, how about just an impersonal thing like Star Wars Force? And I would probably say, the reason I don't think God finally is impersonal is because of my relationship with nature. And again, this is via C.S. Lewis's Miracle. I can colonize nature. Now, this little rubber thing, this is just a little rubber thing. I'm just trying to figure out a way it could kill me. But, we've colonized this. It's made of petroleum, and we've invented zippers, and, there's all kinds of things here. I guess if I could put it in my mouth, I could gag myself with it. I could kill myself with this little rubber thing. And in that way, perhaps nature would conquer me. But we have so thoroughly colonized nature, and I think that is a difference between the personal and the impersonal. And so when, people... Every time in Star Wars, when someone says use the Force, I think you're basically validating my argument, because the personal uses the impersonal. Now, the impersonal is very powerful, but the personal uses the impersonal. Actually, just last night, I watched Justice League with one of my sons, and spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the movie and you're going to see the movie, close your ears for the next few minutes. So 1, 2, 3, here comes the spoiler, which is probably not a big deal, but guess what? Remember Superman died in the last movie? He comes back to life. Surprise, surprise. But then he comes back to life, and okay, so there we'll see, Benny. He's got, super strength and all the problems with the Superman character. I mean, he's Superman. He can do anything. But he comes back to life, and the real question is, what's going to go on with his head? because he can have super strength, and he can have super speed, and he can have supervision, and he can supervision, not supervision. He can have all these things, but it's his personhood that governs. And that's where the interesting story lies. So this is who we are. Now, Scott Adams and Sam Harris disagree on Trump. And again, this is where we're watching a movie. In a sense, Sam Harris and Scott Adams are sitting and watching their movie. And Adams says, "Oh, there's two movies." And Sam says, "No, there's really one movie. There's really one movie, and I'm going to argue with it." And they don't agree. Jordan Peterson, Dillahunty can't agree on God, but they still sit on the stage together, and they joke about throwing Sam Harris off the stage. Well, why is that? Well, because we know a lot more than we know. And, you know, last year I read Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond, and the Jim Elliot and Elizabeth Elliot story, Beyond the Gates of Splendor. That's a very famous Christian story. But basically my point in this is that, you know, when, let's say, for example, when the Spanish first land in the Americas and the Native Americans see them, you know, it's not unlikely that there's going to be bloodshed. In fact, it's almost definite. And so when you meet another human being, if you don't have anything commonality, it's probably going to be one dies and is killed by the other. But now we have this entire thing built in, and now so you've got Peterson and all this stuff that's built into us via, you know, our common heritage. You've got stuff built into us via our common cultures, and you can begin to get a sense of how this is. So when Jordan Peterson and Dillahunty sit on a stage, they're dressed nice, they're behaved. There's you know, they can do a lot of talking. In fact, they could probably talk about a lot of other things more than they can talk about God. Why? Because if you get your mind around this, and again, Peterson has made this point in his Maps of Meaning and Personalities class, there's a whole lot there that's enabling this that we don't see. Well, why don't we see it? Because we've already built it into everything around us. And so the kind of refined tuning we're doing, you know, on one observer might look like, yeah, you got two guys on the stage arguing. Well, that's one way to say it. But those of us who've been interested in the conversation, and you just have to stop and pause and say, what an amazing world we live in. What amazing creatures we are. What an amazing civilization. You know, we are the most blessed. We are the most blessed creatures you could imagine. Boy, what a rambly video. And then I saw this. Someone had tweeted me this, questions no Christians can answer, and they had a whole bunch of atheists who are skeptics and wanting to engage in Christians, and you know what fun! There are Christians who want to do that too, and so part of me looked at that and said, boy, that would be fun. I'd love to talk to some of these guys. But notice again, always when, you know, the Dillahunty thing, you know, who won? Well, that's framing it one way. And now again, when you get into Petersonian terms, well, we're not, you know, he and Kathy Newman, they should have a conversation. Now there's a world behind that word choice, and this is exactly why Jordan Peterson kvetched at the pronouns, because he's saying, even with the words we pick, we are sneaking in worlds. And in defense of theologians and philosophers who wind up arguing about worlds, this is something that philosophers and theologians know. Every single word sneaks in a world. Tolkien knew that. Lewis knew that. Finding the right word is critically important. And that's in a sense where writing often has an advantage over extemporaneous speaking, which I'm doing now. So, you know, what fun to sit down and talk to atheists. And in that sense, again, can you get to know each other well enough to have a productive conversation? Best yet, can you become friends? Can you like each other? And can you, you know, basically, if you can like each other, the more commonality you can find, the more connections you can have with the other person, probably, and this gets ironic, probably the better conversation you can have, and probably in some ways the more heated conversation, because, and that's the reason that husband and wives fight. There's a lot on the line. And even though they know each other probably better than any other human being in the world knows them, there's always a ton on the line. And that's why being married and staying married, I've been married 30 years, is hard. And that's why if, any of you ever get the idea that you want to ask me to perform your wedding, you should think twice about it, because my wedding sermons, people usually gasp when they hear what I say, because I tell them basically, you're standing here promising to love each other, and a year from now, I might very well go out to coffee with one of you, and you'll complain like crazy about the other person and think you were nuts for marrying them. How could you possibly, you can't even possibly live with this other person. And sometimes it doesn't take 1 year, sometimes it takes 7, sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes people are fighting even before they get married. So you figure it out. But that's the world we live in. And so, I was going to mention, if you look at Alan Jacobs' book, How to Think, he's got an appendix in there with basically rules for thinking and rules for talking. And they have everything to do with, don't talk for victory, talk for understanding. And if you can have a conversation with someone with which you've got significant disagreements, if you can begin to understand each other, it will even be more productive with respect to the places you don't agree. And so that in some ways was part of the problem with the Jordan Peterson-Dillahunty conversation, and part of the problem with the Jordan Peterson William Craig Evans conversation. And that's why in some ways a Dillahunty William Craig Evans conversation would be a little bit easier, because they're more on the same page, and they're both in a sense playing the same game, and they've lined everything up. And this is why I think Peterson, with his phenomenology, with his pragmatism, with his psychological understanding, he comes around, and the modernists don't quite know what to do with him. And this again is why I think he is significant, because of Peterson. And Peterson doesn't even know what he's doing. And this gets onto my last slide, that here we are, not only are we these moments going in time, we are so complex. We are also these cloud of witnesses. And you're talking right now, to use Jonathan Haidt's term, you're talking right now to Paul Vanderklay's rider, not the elephant. But the rider and the elephant, they're pretty deeply attached. And now let's switch focuses to more of a depth psychology perspective, where you're talking right now to this conscious Paul Vanderklay, who is living in this moment, who is talking to his computer, who is going to upload this to YouTube, who is intending to read the comments of what people say to this, and look at how many people viewed it, and all the crazy things that I do. But within me are these watchers, these little sub Paul Vanderklays, and all of these sub Paul Vanderklays are, have all grown through history with me, and the books that I've read, and the way that my parents parented me, and the Christianity I grew up in, and the town that I grew up in, and the friendships that I had, and then all of the jobs that I had, and getting married, and having children, and watching videos, and watching TV, and reading books, and pastoring a church, and doing hobbies, and on. So again, I can't even make the graphics for this. All of these are coming in, and all of this is being developed. And again, to think about the fact that, I'm 54 right now. Who knows? My father died when he was 77. My grandfather died when he was 90. Who knows how long I'll live? I don't know. I mean, I could drive in my car tonight, have a terrible accident, and again, my head gets squashed like a grape. And you might say, oh, all that stuff in Paul Vanderklay's brain, it's gone. And rightfully, some of you would say, good riddance, glad Vanderklay's gone. He won't make any annoying videos. Then why are you watching? You should go see a psychologist and figure out why you're watching videos of me if they annoy you. But But I would say as a Christian, and this gets back to the resurrection, that I know that my Redeemer lives. And what Christianity says is that he will raise me. And you might say, well, what do you mean he'll raise you? I'm saying that he knows me. And even this way of knowing a person, someone asked, have you written a book? No. Why not? Because I'm too ADHD. Because, have you seen my videos? There's a reason I haven't written a book. Look at my videos. I can hardly control myself here. But I was thinking, I actually did some work on a book a number of years ago, and it had everything to do with, here's a term, relationalism. The fact that I know Paul Vanderklay in a way that no one else does. Because, even this guy, even this guy. I know Paul Vanderklay in a way that no one else does. Okay. My wife knows me, and sometimes my wife is talking to me, and it's like, do you know me? That's not me. Well, I've got my biases. She's got her biases. She's got her limited slice of me. I've even got my limited slice of myself. I was, chatting with my sister yesterday. Both of my sisters know me in ways I don't know myself. My congregation at church knows me in ways I don't know myself. My dog knows me in ways I don't know myself. My dog knows how I smell in a way that I don't know because my dog smells better than I do. My children know me in ways that I don't know myself, and I have 5 of them, which means that each of them sees me through their biases, but all of those biases probably also enable. So each of them probably know aspects of me better than I know myself. And then you'd have to ask, well, how could God raise me? Well, God knows all of that, and God knows me better than even the sum total of my congregation and my wife and my dog and my kids, because he knows me all the way from my beginning, all the way from when he knitted me together in my mother's womb. He knows me that well, and so how could I be resurrected? Well, in some ways, I could argue that my material me is incidental. And let's use a metaphor of this. So one of my sons has a 3D printer, and he's making stuff, and he bought it used for like $200, and it doesn't always work. So he just ran out to the library because the library has a better one, and he's printing that, and he got an engineering degree, and so he's playing around with 3D printers. Well, in a sense, you might consider the resurrection to be God 3D printing the world. And you might say, well, that sounds kind of wild. And what's your proof of that? Well, proof, that's such a proof points us in the wrong direction. Why do I believe that? I believe that because Jesus walked from the tomb. And I believe that because now you might say, well, yeah, but if I'm sitting in a grave, or if I'm cremated, or if I'm lost at sea, or what have you, how can God put me together? Well, he put me together once. Why would I imagine he couldn't do it again? Why would I imagine he couldn't make a copy of me? Now how will he? And this is where, as Christians, we say we have no idea. And if you read, see, I've got 1 Corinthians 15 rolling around in my head. If you saw a rough draft for Sunday yesterday, and I'm preaching it tomorrow, I'm always working on my sermon until I preach it, and then I start working on the next one. But later in that chapter, Paul says, we'll have a spiritual body, and that really sent a lot of people in the wrong direction. But if you understand how Paul uses the word spiritual, his point is that in our resurrected body, we will, this gets into some C.S. Lewis stuff too, we will be fully, it's so hard to talk about, we will be fully created by the Spirit. We will be fully in line with the Spirit. And so then if you listen to Jonathan Peugeot's talk with, I forgot his name again, Higgins, JFH, I think that's what it is. Jonathan was talking about becoming becoming, I got to be careful with this because I'm a Protestant, more like God. In what ways are we like God? Well, we're not going to be eternal because that ship has sailed. But we will be more like him, and we will be like him in like him as he intends us to be. C.S. Lewis makes the point in one of his books that we might imagine that as we become more like Christ, we will start to look identical, like things that my son can print on a 3D printer. And C.S. Lewis says, no, actually, when we become more like Christ, we actually become more unique, become more like the Paul Vanderklay that the Lord predestined from all of eternity. There's a little Calvinism for you. Will become exactly who he intends me to be. And I don't know what that is. And you say, well, will that be more like the Paul Vanderklay who was 20? Or will that be the 54-year-old Paul Vanderklay? What if when Paul Vanderklay is 90, he has Alzheimer's and he forgets who he is? And I would say, God knows. God knows all of this. And I'm not worried about it. Well, why aren't you worried about it? Because I can't control it. Why worry about it? And I trust him. I think finally, so one of the points I was making is that your modernists like Dillahunty and like William Craig Evans, in some ways I might make the argument that they're both Protestant. And this gets into, again, this long stream of things. Because I think modern atheism is very Protestant. And that's why this Dillahunty versus William Craig Evans is kind of modernist Protestantism working out its stuff. And, the social justice warriors are, postmodern Protestantism working out its stuff. And the stuff going on in the United States today is a Christendom civil war. Well, where was I going with this? See, I'm already getting senile. I trust God with the resurrection. And I think trust is exactly the issue that's involved. When the more you think about how little we are in control of everything, the only resolution for anxiety is trust. To believe that, and again, this is why I'm a Calvinist, to believe that God is this big and this powerful and this good. Now you might say, yeah, but with double predestination, is he really good? And, well, we could talk about double predestination sometime. That's a very complicated, and I'm not always convinced, a terribly productive argument. Calvin, this gets into some ugly corners of Calvinism that I don't really have a lot of interest going into because I haven't seen them to be terribly productive. But what I think the biblical doctrine of election communicates is that it's not finally up to us. And now again, as is Jonathan? Oh. See, I gotta go all the way back. It's terrible of me to forget his name. I'm even his Facebook friend now. James. The reason Paul starts out the book of Ephesians with these passages about being, predestined is, I think, to give the Ephesians a sense of it's both and again, a sense of this is God's plan, he's working it out, and it's this great adventure that we have to act in. And this is why, Dillahunty, at one point I heard him say, I'm a compatibilist. I said, so am I. I'm a compatibilist Calvinist, because on one hand, God has ordained it. On the other hand, we have to do it. We have to work it out. And that's why I always go misery, deliverance, gratitude, that all that we do is in gratitude. It's response to him. And he saves us in spite of ourselves, and he saves us despite ourselves. And I think that's the best way to language it. Yet there's a story that I told someone recently. It's probably apocryphal. It's about Augustine. And the reason the Orthodox and the Western Church, deal with election differently is because of Augustine. Because the Western Church started dealing with Augustine, or starting dealing with election, and that all goes back to Augustine, which is why the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans and the Calvinists, they're all they've basically got the same doctrine of election. It goes down to Augustine. And it's probably knotted up in Platonism in some ways, or Neoplatonism. So, have fun with that in the comment section. But, and that's the reason. So the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Church, they were having different conversations. And so they dealt with those passages in different ways. Does that mean I don't believe in election? No, I do. But it's interesting when you get to, let's say, the materialists, who want to say, philosophically, their system winds up becoming determinism. And as a Calvinist, I look at that and say, I know something about determinism. We've been talking about that stuff for years. And yet, determinism, you can hardly find determinism in, that's true. You can't find determinism in the Bible. It's just more complicated than that. So Tim Keller has a good sermon on this. I highlighted something else from Tim Keller. I'm rambling terribly. I was going to do a short video, and here I'm going on an hour. So feel free not to watch it, which is a terrible thing to say at the end of the video. But anyway, back to this conversation. Good conversation. It was, I don't know how interested all of you would be in it. In some ways, James is working out his stuff. Jonathan is, dealing with a lot of his Orthodox stuff, and it's just fun listening to Jonathan's journey. This is what I wanted to say. So, another thing. Both with respect to denominations and with respect to how to talk about the Reformation, the beginning of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity is gold. Because I think at the beginning of that book, Lewis nicely gives us a vision for how we should handle denominationalism. And Lewis's take on the Reformation was this. The conversations that needed to happen between Martin Luther and the Pope should have happened, and this is classic Lewis, should have happened in an English pub over some good beers by a warm fireplace between good friends. Because there's real things that have to be worked out between the three major branches of the church: the Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and the Protestants. We should work them out as brothers and sisters in Christ. There, I said it. And so when I look at Jonathan Pajot, he's a brother in Christ. And when I look at James, he's a brother in Christ. Now you might say, what about the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons? Yeah, well, I'll take them on a case-by-case basis, okay? I'll give you that. Well, even that could get me into some trouble. And the reason I say that is, again, also in the beginning of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis has a really good dialogue about how we use this word of describing someone as a Christian. And that is also worth reading. So maybe I'll, in one of my videos, walk through some of that more carefully, because that then gets into this conversation. Is Jordan Peterson a Christian? By C.S. Lewis's definition there, you'd have to say in some ways no, because he's not classified as that. And C.S. Lewis compares that with, say, the use of the term gentleman. You want to be in the video? Huh? You want to be in the video? I've wanted to get my dog in the video for a long time. So say hello to the audience, Mookie. My dog has a problem with his liquor. He can't hold his liquor. So when I put him up, he gets nervous and he just starts licking. So there's my dog. Anyway, this is probably the worst video I've ever made. But C.S. Lewis at the beginning of Mere Christianity talks about, what it means to be a Christian and who is a Christian. And so in that first introduction, these issues that James is dealing with, I got his name right. See, I learn. It's all those moments. I've got to create those pathways in my increasingly old brain. All of these issues about denominations, about identifying someone as a Christian, and about the Protestant Reformation and C.S. Lewis's vision of maybe how it should have been dealt with. They're all at the beginning of Mere Christianity. So James, definitely read that. And here's another question that if I were talking to C.S. Lewis, I would say, yeah, but why did the Reformation play out the way it did? And, as I continue to listen to Jonathan and learn about orthodoxy, I could ask, why did the Great Schism play out the way it did, which was, obviously something far early, where the Bishop of Rome excommunicates all the other patriarchs, and the patriarchs excommunicate the Bishop of Rome, and, very sad history. And so I have hope, and strong hope, that at the consummation, at the renewal of all things, all those wounds will be healed too. Now, I can't help when I think about, so if someone says, well, what kind of church should I go to? I would probably say that depends on a lot of things. Should I be Christian Reformed? I'd love it if you were. It might not be the best church for you. Well, how can you figure out the best church? Well, it would be the church that would be most productive in bringing you to become the person that Christ intends you to be. Then you might say, well, that should be the church I'm happiest in. And I would probably say it may very well be the opposite, because it's usually through our struggles and trials that we grow the most. Now, then you say, well, then it's the church that I hate most. No, that's probably not it, because now you're into the Peterson chaos order thing. It's going to have to have the right mix of enough like you to be productive, but enough against you to rub you and turn that grain of sand into a pearl. So here it is, my worst video ever, the most rambly, the most unsolicited advice, the most butting into another conversation where I wasn't invited. And that's when I look at the videos I've made, I think, boy, what a jerk this guy is. These people are having a nice conversation about Christianity, and you're just gonna butt in. Well, that's because I'm from New Jersey, and we're rude. So yeah, there it is. Worst video I've ever made. If you got to this point, leave me a nasty comment, and yeah, tell me how much you hate it.